Hi, I'm Maya. My sister's fiancé cornered me at their rehearsal dinner, told me I was more beautiful than the bride, and tried to kiss me while she was upstairs getting ready. When I told my family, they accused me of being jealous and trying to sabotage the wedding. My own mother said I was making up stories for attention, but what none of them knew is that I had my phone recording in my pocket the entire time. And 12 hours later, as my sister said I do, 300 wedding guests heard his voice echoing through the church speakers, telling me exactly what he thought about his future wife. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning of October 15th started like any other Saturday in Millbrook Heights, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. Golden leaves, scattered across the manicured lawns of the historic Riverside Manor, where my sister Charlotte was about to marry the man she'd been calling her soulmate for 2 years. The venue buzzed with that particular energy that comes before big events, when everyone's trying to look perfect while secretly panicking about 1,000 tiny details. I'd been up since 5:30, helping coordinate the vendors and making sure everything ran smoothly. That's always been my role in the family, the reliable one who handles logistics while everyone else focuses on the glamorous parts. Charlotte was getting her hair done in the bridal suite upstairs, surrounded by her bridesmaids who kept taking selfies and posting them with captions about the most beautiful bride ever. Meanwhile, I was downstairs in my navy dress, checking that the florist had delivered the right centerpieces and that the caterers knew about Aunt Linda's shellfish allergy. The rehearsal dinner was set for 6 o'clock, just family, and the wedding party, about 40 people total. Charlotte had insisted on having it at the same venue as the wedding, claiming it would be more convenient for everyone. Really, she just wanted another chance to show off the space she'd spent 18 months planning. The main dining room had been transformed with white linens, crystal glasses, and enough candles to illuminate a small city. Everything was exactly as Charlotte had envisioned, down to the specific shade of blush pink she'd obsessed over for months. By 4:30, the early guests were starting to arrive. My parents pulled up in their silver Mercedes, my father adjusting his tie for the 3rd time while my mother checked her lipstick in the visor mirror. They'd been married 32 years and still coordinated their outfits for events like this. Dad wore his navy suit with the burgundy tie Mom had picked out, while she'd chosen a burgundy dress that complemented perfectly. They'd always been a united front, especially when it came to family appearances. Charlotte's future in-laws, the Hendersons, arrived next in their black BMW. Richard and Patricia Henderson were the kind of people who measured success by zip codes and vacation destinations. They owned 3 restaurants in the city and lived in a house that could have been featured in Architectural Digest. Patricia wore diamonds that caught the light from 20 feet away, while Richard sported a watch that probably cost more than my car. They'd been skeptical about Charlotte at first, worried she wasn't sophisticated enough for their son, but she'd won them over with her charm and her marketing degree from Northwestern. The star of the evening, of course, was Marcus Henderson himself. At 6'2", with dark hair and the kind of confident smile that made people pay attention, he had a way of commanding any room he entered. He'd played lacrosse in college, worked at his father's corporate consulting firm, and drove a Tesla that he'd somehow managed to make seem both environmentally conscious and expensive. Charlotte had met him at a charity gala where she was working as an event coordinator, and she'd called me that same night, breathless with excitement about the incredible man she'd just met. Marcus arrived fashionably late as usual, just as the cocktail hour was beginning. He walked through the French doors in his charcoal gray suit, stopping to shake hands with my father and kiss my mother's cheek with practiced ease. He had this way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room, at least for the 30 seconds he was talking to them. It was a skill that had served him well in business, and apparently, in romance. The evening progressed exactly as Charlotte had planned. The cocktail hour featured her favorite champagne and those little appetizers she'd sampled 6 times before choosing. Everyone mingled and complimented the venue and talked about how excited they were for tomorrow. My cousin Rebecca, who was Charlotte's maid of honor, gave a toast about sisterhood and love that made several people tear up. Uncle Tom told the same jokes he'd been telling at family gatherings for 20 years, but everyone laughed anyway because weddings make people generous with their laughter. I spent most of the evening making sure everything ran smoothly, refilling water glasses and checking with the kitchen staff about timing for dinner service. It's not that I minded being helpful, but sometimes I wondered what it would be like to just be a guest at one of these things, instead of the person everyone turned to when something needed fixing. Charlotte never asked me to handle these details. I just did it automatically, the same way I'd been handling things for her since we were kids. The dinner itself was perfect, at least on the surface. Charlotte sat at the head table between Marcus and my mother, glowing in a way that made it obvious how happy she was. She'd chosen a simple white dress for the rehearsal, saving the real drama for tomorrow. But she still managed to be the center of attention. Marcus played his part perfectly, holding her hand during the toasts and looking at her with exactly the right amount of adoration for someone who was getting married in less than 24 hours. But I noticed things other people missed. I saw how his eyes wandered when Charlotte was talking to someone else. I caught him checking his phone under the table during my father's speech about marriage and commitment. Most telling of all, I noticed how his gaze kept drifting to other women in the room, including the young server who was refilling wine glasses. It wasn't obvious enough for anyone else to pick up on, but I'd always been good at reading people's micro-expressions. After dinner, while Charlotte was upstairs touching up her makeup and getting pictures with her bridesmaids, I found myself alone in the small parlor off the main dining room, trying to coordinate tomorrow's timeline with the wedding planner. The room was quiet, except for the distant sound of laughter from the main party, and I was grateful for a few minutes of peace to review the schedule one more time. That's when Marcus walked in, closing the door behind him with a soft click that somehow seemed louder than it should have been. He'd loosened his tie and undone the top button of his shirt, and there was something different about the way he was looking at me. Not the polite brotherly way he usually did, but something else entirely. Something that made the small room feel even smaller. "Maya," he said, and even the way he said my name sounded different. "I've been wanting to talk to you alone all evening." I looked up from my clipboard, confused. "Is everything okay? Do you need something for tomorrow?" He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the slight flush in his cheeks from the wine. "You know, I've always thought you were the more interesting sister." The words hit me like cold water. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "What?" "Charlotte's beautiful. Don't get me wrong," he continued, as if he was discussing the weather. "But you're different. More mysterious, more real." I felt my phone buzzing in my pocket, probably a text from the wedding planner. But I didn't dare look away from Marcus. Something was very wrong with this conversation, and every instinct I had was telling me to get out of that room as quickly as possible. "Marcus, I think you should go back to the party," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Charlotte's probably looking for you." But instead of leaving, he stepped even closer, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. "She doesn't have to know," he said softly. "This could just be between us." And that's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding or too much wine talking. This was calculated, deliberate. The man who was marrying my sister in 12 hours was standing in a closed room, telling me I was more interesting than she was and suggesting we keep secrets from her. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, where my phone was still buzzing. Without thinking, I pressed the voice recording app, the one I'd downloaded months ago to record meeting notes at work. The screen stayed black, but I knew it was capturing everything. "Maya," Marcus said again, reaching up to touch my face. "You're so much more beautiful than she is. I pulled away from Marcus so quickly that I knocked over the small crystal vase on the side table behind me. The sound of it hitting the hardwood floor seemed to echo through the entire manor, and for a moment, we both froze. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway, and Marcus stepped back with the kind of smooth casualness that told me this wasn't his first time being almost caught in a compromising position. "Everything all right in there?" called my cousin David's voice from outside the door. "Just knocked something over," I managed to call back, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "All good." Marcus straightened his tie and walked to the window, suddenly very interested in the view of the garden outside. When David poked his head in a few seconds later, he found Marcus studying the landscaping while I crouched down collecting pieces of broken crystal. "Mom's looking for you, Marcus," David said. "Something about the photographer wanting family shots before everyone leaves." "Of course," Marcus replied smoothly. "Maya, sorry about the vase. I'll make sure Charlotte knows it was my fault." He left without looking at me again, but I could feel the weight of what had just happened settling into my bones. I stayed in that room for another 10 minutes, carefully picking up every shard of crystal while my mind raced. My phone was still recording, safely capturing the ambient sounds of the manor and my own shaky breathing. The thing about being the responsible sister is that you learn to handle crises quietly. You don't make scenes. You don't create drama. You fix problems before they become problems, and you keep family peace at all costs. I'd been doing it since I was 7 years old, and Charlotte came home crying because a boy in her class had pulled her hair. I was the one who marched up to that boy the next day and told him exactly what would happen if he touched my sister. Again. Not because I was brave, but because someone had to protect her. Growing up, Charlotte had always been the shining star of our family. She was 2 years older than me, naturally blonde where I was brunette, outgoing where I was reserved, the kind of person who made friends instantly and never met a camera she didn't love. She'd been homecoming queen, prom queen, and captain of the debate team. She studied marketing at Northwestern while I stayed closer to home and got my accounting degree from state. She moved to the city and landed a job at a prestigious event planning firm while I worked for a small nonprofit in our hometown. Our parents had never played favorites, at least not openly, but there was an unspoken understanding that Charlotte was destined for bigger things. She was the one they bragged about at dinner parties, the one whose career updates got shared with the neighbors, the one whose love life was a constant source of fascination and speculation. When she started dating Marcus 2 years ago, it was like all of their dreams for her had finally aligned. Successful businessman, good family, handsome, charming, he checked every box they'd ever had for their daughter's future husband. I'd always been perfectly fine with my role as the supportive sister. I didn't need to be the center of attention. I found genuine satisfaction in my work at the Millbrook Community Foundation, where I managed budgets for local nonprofits and helped coordinate fundraising events. It wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful, and I was good at it. I had my own small apartment downtown, a reliable car, and a circle of close friends who appreciated my dry sense of humor and dependability. But standing in that parlor, surrounded by broken crystal and the lingering scent of Marcus's cologne, I realized that my lifetime of being the peacekeeper had left me completely unprepared for this kind of situation. What do you do when the person your sister is about to marry reveals himself to be exactly the kind of man you'd warn her away from? What do you do when you have proof of something that will destroy her happiness, but no way to share it without destroying your entire family? I finished cleaning up the crystal and rejoined the party, slipping back into my role as the helpful sister who made sure everyone had what they needed. The evening continued exactly as planned. Charlotte came back, downstairs glowing and perfect, accepting hugs and well wishes from relatives who kept telling her how lucky she was. Marcus resumed his position as the devoted fiancé, wrapping his arm around her waist and smiling for pictures with exactly the right amount of affection. The only person who seemed to notice anything different was my grandmother, who had an uncanny ability to read people's emotions. She was 83 and sharp as ever, with steel gray hair and pale blue eyes that missed nothing. She'd been watching me carefully all evening, and when I passed her table during coffee service, she reached out and touched my arm. "You look pale, sweetheart," she said quietly. "Everything all right?" My grandmother was the one person in our family who'd never bought into the idea that problems should be swept under the rug for the sake of appearances. She'd lived through the Depression, World War II, and raising 4 children while working. As a nurse, she had no patience for pretense or polite lies. "Just tired, Grandma," I said. "Long day tomorrow." She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, you know where to find me if you need to talk. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when everyone else is too busy celebrating to listen." I spent the rest of the evening mechanically going through the motions. I helped coordinate the gift opening, made sure the leftover flowers were distributed to the older relatives, and double-checked the timeline with the wedding planner for tomorrow. All the while, my phone sat heavy in my pocket, containing a recording that I didn't know what to do with. The last guest left around 10:30, and Charlotte practically floated upstairs to her suite, already talking about how perfect tomorrow was going to be. Marcus left with his parents, kissing Charlotte goodbye at the front door like a perfect gentleman, shaking my father's hand, and telling my mother how much he was looking forward to officially joining the family. "See you at the altar," he called out cheerfully as he walked to his car. He didn't look at me once. After everyone left, I helped my parents pack up the leftover decorations and personal items that needed to go home with us. My father was in an expansive mood, talking about how well the evening had gone and how proud he was of both his daughters. My mother kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, overcome with emotion about her firstborn getting married. "Maya did such a beautiful job organizing everything," she said to my father as we loaded boxes into their car. "I don't know what we would have done without her." It was meant as a compliment, but something about it stung. I'd spent the entire evening making sure everyone else had a perfect time, and the one moment I'd needed someone to notice that something was wrong, everyone had been too busy celebrating to see it. I drove home to my apartment in silence, the recording app still running on my phone. I'd forgotten to turn it off, so it had captured hours of ambient party noise, conversations I wasn't part of, and the sound of my own breathing as I'd moved through the evening on autopilot. When I finally parked in my driveway and turned off the engine, I sat in the darkness for a long time, staring at my phone screen. The recording was 4 hours and 17 minutes long. Somewhere in those 4 hours was proof of what Marcus had said to me, but also proof of how normal the rest of the evening had been. Proof of how easily he'd slipped back into his role as the perfect fiancé, how seamlessly he'd continued charming my family, how completely he'd acted as if nothing had happened. Inside my apartment, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on my couch, finally allowing myself to really think about what had occurred. Marcus Henderson, the man my sister was marrying in 12 hours, had told me I was more beautiful than she was. He'd suggested we keep secrets from her. He'd tried to touch my face in a way that had nothing to do with brotherly affection. And tomorrow, I was supposed to smile and stand at that altar and watch Charlotte marry him, knowing what I knew, carrying the weight of his words in my pocket like a stone I couldn't put down. The worst part wasn't even what he'd said. The worst part was how calculated it had felt. This wasn't a man who'd had too much to drink and made a mistake. This was someone who'd been watching me, thinking about me, planning what he wanted to say. Someone who'd deliberately isolated me in that room and tested the waters to see how I'd respond. I thought about Charlotte upstairs at the manor, probably lying awake with excitement about tomorrow, maybe texting her bridesmaids about last-minute details or scrolling through wedding photos she'd saved on Pinterest. She was so happy, so completely in love with the man she thought Marcus was. How do you tell someone that their prince is actually a predator? How do you destroy their fairy tale with evidence they'll never want to believe? I sat on my couch until nearly 3 a.m, holding my phone and staring at the recording that could change everything. By the time I finally went to bed, I still hadn't decided what to do with it. But I knew that in a few hours, I'd have to get up and put on my bridesmaid dress and pretend that everything was fine. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent my entire life being the sister who fixed problems. And now I was facing the one problem I didn't know how to fix. The alarm on my phone went off at 6:30, though I'd been awake for the better part of 2 hours, staring at the ceiling and replaying every word Marcus had said to me. The wedding wasn't until 4 in the afternoon, but Charlotte had scheduled hair and makeup to start at 8, followed by a full day of preparation activities that she'd been planning for months. As her maid of honor, I was expected to be at the manor by 7:30 to help coordinate the morning logistics. I showered and dressed in yoga pants and a comfortable sweater, knowing I'd be changing into my bridesmaid dress later. The pale green silk dress Charlotte had chosen hung on my closet door, still in its protective bag from the bridal shop. She'd selected it specifically because it complemented her wedding colors without competing with her own gown. Everything Charlotte did was strategic like that, carefully planned to create the perfect aesthetic for her perfect day. Driving back to Riverside Manor in the morning light, I found myself analyzing every interaction I'd ever had with Marcus Henderson. When Charlotte had first introduced him to the family 18 months ago, he'd been charming in that practiced way that successful people often are. He'd asked thoughtful questions about my work at the foundation, complimented my mother's cooking, and engaged my father in conversations about sports and current events. He'd been exactly what you'd want your sister's boyfriend to be: attentive, respectful, clearly smitten with her. But now, with the clarity that comes from having your worldview shattered, I started remembering moments that had felt slightly off at the time. The way his hand had lingered on my shoulder when he'd hugged me hello at family gatherings. The compliments that felt just a little too personal for a future brother-in-law. The way he'd sometimes catch my eye across the room during dinner conversations, holding the gaze just a beat longer than was comfortable. At Charlotte's birthday party 6 months ago, he'd cornered me in the kitchen while I was helping serve dessert, standing close enough that I'd had to step back against the counter. He'd asked me about my dating life in a way that felt more like fishing for information than casual conversation. When I'd mentioned that I was seeing someone casually, he'd smiled and said, "Well, he's a lucky guy. Whoever ends up with you permanently is going to hit the jackpot." I'd chalked it up to wine and brotherly affection, but now I wondered if it had been something else entirely. The most unsettling memory came flooding back as I pulled into the manor's parking lot. 2 months ago, at our cousin's graduation party, Marcus had offered to drive me home because I'd had a headache and wanted to leave early. Charlotte had been deep in conversation with our aunts about wedding planning, and he'd volunteered to make sure I got home safely. During the 20-minute drive, he'd asked increasingly personal questions about my relationships, my living situation, whether I ever got lonely living by myself. "You know, Maya," he'd said as we'd sat in his Tesla outside my apartment building, "you're really underestimated by your family. They see Charlotte as the social butterfly, but you're the one with real depth, real substance." At the time, I'd been flattered. It was nice to hear someone acknowledge that I was more than just the quiet, responsible sister. But now I realized it had been a test. A way of gauging whether I was receptive to being separated from Charlotte in his mind, whether I could be made to feel special by being told I was different from her. I'd thanked him politely and gone inside, but he'd sat in his car for several minutes afterward, watching my building. I'd seen him from my second-floor window, just sitting there in the darkness, and it had given me an uneasy feeling that I'd pushed down at the time. Marcus Henderson was a predator, but he was a sophisticated one. He didn't operate like the obvious creeps you read about in news stories. He was subtle, patient, strategic. He'd spent 18 months building trust with my family, establishing himself as the perfect boyfriend and future husband, creating a reputation that would make any accusations against him seem impossible to believe. The manor was already bustling with activity when I arrived. The wedding planner, a severe woman named Victoria who commanded respect through sheer competence, was directing a team of florists as they transformed the ceremony space. Charlotte's bridesmaids were arriving in clusters, carrying garment bags and overnight cases, chattering excitedly about the day ahead. I found Charlotte in the bridal suite, sitting in front of a Hollywood-style mirror while her hairstylist worked on creating the elaborate updo she'd been practicing for weeks. She was already glowing with that particular radiance that comes with being the center of attention on your most important day. Her silk robe was monogrammed with her new initials, CSH, Charlotte Stewart Henderson, even though she wouldn't officially be a Henderson for several more hours. "Maya!" she squealed when she saw me, careful not to move her head too much while the stylist worked. "I can barely believe this day is finally here. Did you sleep at all?" "I think I got maybe 3 hours. I kept waking up thinking I'd forgotten something important." "You haven't forgotten anything," I assured her, settling into the chair beside her. "Everything's going to be perfect." And it was true. Charlotte had planned this wedding with military precision. She had detailed timelines, backup plans for the backup plans, and enough organizational systems to run a small corporation. She'd been dreaming of her wedding day since she was 8 years old, collecting magazine clippings and Pinterest boards and vendor recommendations. This wasn't just a wedding to her. It was the culmination of everything she'd ever wanted for her life. "Marcus texted me this morning," she said, beaming at her reflection in the mirror. "He said he barely slept either because he's so excited to marry me. Isn't that sweet? He's not supposed to contact me today. It's bad luck. But I'm glad he did. I love knowing he's just as nervous and excited as I am." The hairstylist, a woman named Cassandra, who'd flown in from New York City specifically for this wedding, worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that her reputation was on the line. Charlotte had found her through a celebrity wedding blog and had paid an extraordinary amount of money to secure her services. Every curl was placed with mathematical precision, every bobby pin strategically positioned. "He's such a romantic," Charlotte continued, her voice dreamy with contentment. "Last night at dinner, he kept looking at me like he couldn't believe I was real. And when we said goodbye, he whispered that today was going to be the beginning of our forever. I literally melted. I made appropriate murmuring sounds while mentally calculating how many hours of my life I'd spent listening to Charlotte gush about Marcus. She'd been infatuated with him from their very first date, when he'd taken her to an exclusive restaurant she'd only read about in magazines. He'd planned elaborate romantic gestures, surprise weekend trips, jewelry that arrived with handwritten notes, flowers delivered to her office with messages that made her coworkers swoon. But now I understood that Marcus's romantic gestures weren't expressions of love. They were investments. He was building a narrative, creating a relationship so publicly perfect that no one would ever question his character or motivations. Charlotte wasn't just his fiancé. She was his cover story, his proof of being a good man who deserved trust and admiration. The makeup artist arrived shortly after 9, wheeling in a professional kit that looked like it belonged on a movie set. Charlotte had hired someone who specialized in bridal photography, understanding that these pictures would be displayed in her home for the rest of her life. Every decision she'd made about this wedding was filtered through the lens of creating lasting perfection. As the morning progressed, the bridal suite filled with Charlotte's closest friends and female relatives. My mother arrived with tears already, in her eyes, overwhelmed by the emotion of seeing her eldest daughter transformed into a bride. My aunts clustered around offering advice and sharing stories from their own wedding days. Charlotte's college roommate produced a bottle of champagne that she'd been saving specifically for this moment. The energy in the room was infectious, and despite everything I knew about Marcus, I found myself getting caught up in the celebration. This was Charlotte's day, the moment she'd been dreaming about her entire life, and seeing her so purely happy was both beautiful and heartbreaking. But then my phone buzzed with a text message and everything changed. The message was from Marcus. Looking forward to seeing you in that bridesmaid dress today. I have a feeling you're going to outshine everyone else. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. He was texting me on his wedding day. Hours before he was supposed to marry my sister, he was sending me messages that had nothing to do with brotherhood or family affection. I deleted the text immediately and tried to focus on Charlotte, who was laughing at something her maid of honor had said while the makeup artist worked on her eyes. But my phone buzzed again 5 minutes later. Hope you saved me a dance tonight. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. This time I didn't delete the message. Instead, I took a screenshot and saved it to the same folder where I'd stored the recording from last night. Marcus Henderson was continuing to pursue me on his wedding day, apparently confident that I would either be flattered by the attention or too intimidated to do anything about it. He'd misjudged me completely. Charlotte looked radiant in the mirror, her hair and makeup transforming her into the bride she'd always envisioned herself becoming. But as I watched her practice her wedding smile, adjusting the angle of her head and the curve of her lips, I realized that she was preparing to marry a man she didn't really know at all. Marcus had spent 18 months showing her exactly what she wanted to see, becoming the perfect boyfriend for someone who valued appearances and social status above everything else. He'd learned her love language and spoken it fluently, making her feel cherished and special while simultaneously evaluating whether her sister might be a more interesting conquest. The worst part was understanding that this was probably a pattern for him. Charlotte wasn't his first victim. She was just his current project. There had probably been other women, other sisters or friends or colleagues who'd found themselves on the receiving end of his attention. Women who'd been made to feel crazy, or jealous or attention-seeking when they'd tried to warn people about his true nature. But unlike those other women, I had evidence. I had his voice on recording, his texts in my phone, and most importantly, I had access to the one moment when he wouldn't be able to control the narrative or manage the situation. I had access to his wedding day. My phone buzzed a third time as Charlotte's photographer arrived to start taking getting-ready photos. This message was longer than the others. You looked beautiful last night. I keep thinking about what you said about us keeping things between ourselves. Maybe we should talk. More about that after the reception when everyone's distracted. I hadn't said anything about keeping things between ourselves. He was already rewriting history, creating a version of events where I'd been a willing participant in whatever he thought had happened between us. But that recording would tell a different story entirely. By noon, the bridal suite had transformed into a carefully orchestrated chaos of silk, lace, and nervous energy. Charlotte sat in the center of it all like a queen holding court, her hair now perfectly styled in an intricate chignon adorned with tiny pearl pins that caught the light every time she moved her head. The makeup artist had just finished her work, creating a look that was both timeless and modern, emphasizing Charlotte's natural beauty while ensuring she'd photograph flawlessly. I'd been relegated to bridesmaid duties, which meant helping younger cousins with their hair, tracking down missing earrings, and making sure everyone stayed hydrated and fed. The bride's lunch had been catered by an upscale bistro downtown, delicate finger sandwiches, fruit that had been cut into perfect geometric shapes, and sparkling water served in crystal glasses. Charlotte had barely touched her food, too excited and nervous to eat, but she'd insisted that everyone else enjoy the meal she'd so carefully planned. The photographer, a woman named Serena who'd shot 3 celebrity weddings this year alone, moved through the room like a silent ghost, capturing candid moments that would later be transformed into the kind of wedding photos that appeared in magazines. She had an uncanny ability to be everywhere and nowhere at once, documenting the intimate moments between Charlotte and our mother, the laughter shared between old friends, the quiet anticipation that filled the spaces between conversations. It was during this peaceful interlude that my phone buzzed again. This time, Marcus had sent a photo. A picture of his groomsmen getting ready in their suite across the property, all of them looking handsome and relaxed in their matching navy suits. but the caption made my stomach lurch. "Wish you were here instead of them." I excused myself to the bathroom, locking the door behind me and staring at my reflection in the ornate mirror above the marble vanity. My own makeup had been professionally done, my hair styled in loose waves that complemented but didn't compete with Charlotte's more elaborate updo. In my pale green bridesmaid dress, I looked exactly like what I was supposed to be, the supportive sister, the perfect complement to the bride's vision. But my hands were shaking as I typed back a simple response. "Please stop texting me. Today is about Charlotte." His reply came immediately. "Everything I do is about Charlotte. But that doesn't mean I can't appreciate her beautiful sister." I deleted the conversation thread and turned off my phone, but the damage was already done. Marcus wasn't going to stop. If anything, my attempt to shut down his advances had only encouraged him. He was the kind of man who saw resistance as a challenge rather than a boundary. Back in the bridal suite, Charlotte was finally getting into her wedding dress, a stunning creation of French lace and silk that had taken her 8 months to find and another 4 months to have tailored to perfection. The dress had been featured in a bridal magazine as an example of timeless elegance, and Charlotte had fallen in love with it instantly, declaring it the one before she'd even tried it on. Watching her transform into a bride was like watching magic happen. The dress fit her perfectly, hugging her curves in all the right places before flowing into a cathedral train that would create stunning photos as she walked down the aisle. Her veil, which had belonged to our grandmother, completed the look with just the right touch of family tradition. "Oh, Charlotte," our mother whispered, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. "You look absolutely perfect." And she did. Charlotte had always been beautiful, but in that moment she was radiant in a way that transcended ordinary prettiness. This was her fairy tale coming true, her chance to be the princess she'd always dreamed of being. Every detail was exactly as she'd envisioned it, from the delicate pearl bracelet she'd borrowed from our aunt to the pale pink nail polish that matched her bouquet. The irony wasn't lost on me that she looked like the perfect bride preparing to marry the perfect groom, when in reality, she was about to legally bind herself to a man who had spent the morning sending inappropriate messages to her sister. At 2 o'clock, we moved to the Manor's bridal preparation room, a smaller space, with better lighting for final touch-ups and last-minute adjustments. Charlotte's veil was attached with military precision, each bobby pin placed to ensure it would stay perfect throughout the ceremony and reception. The photographer captured every moment, creating a visual narrative of the bride's final preparations. That's when the knock came on the door. "Ladies," called Victoria, the wedding planner, from the hallway. "We have a visitor." Charlotte's face lit up with confusion and delight. Who could that be? Victoria opened the door to reveal Marcus standing in the hallway, looking devastatingly handsome in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. His dark hair was styled with just enough product to look effortless, and his boutonniere, a single white rose that matched Charlotte's bouquet, was positioned precisely on his lapel. "Marcus!" Charlotte gasped, automatically reaching up to check her veil. "You're not supposed to see me before the ceremony." He stepped into the room with that confident smile that had charmed our entire family, his eyes immediately finding Charlotte and filling with what looked like genuine emotion. I know," he said, his voice soft with affection. "But I couldn't wait another minute without telling you how much I love you." The room collectively sighed at the romance of it all. Several of Charlotte's bridesmaids pulled out their phones to capture the moment, already composing social media captions about true love and perfect relationships. Even the photographer stepped forward to document this unplanned but incredibly romantic gesture. "I have something for you," Marcus continued, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. "Something I wanted to give you privately before we become husband and wife." Charlotte's hands flew to her mouth in surprise. "Marcus, you've already given me so much." "Not nearly enough," he replied, opening the box to reveal a delicate diamond bracelet that sparkled even in the soft lighting of the preparation room. This belonged to my grandmother. She wore it on her wedding day, and I've been saving it. For the woman I wanted to spend my life with. The gesture was so perfectly romantic, so exactly what every bride dreams of receiving on her wedding day, that even I felt moved by it despite everything I knew about him. Charlotte burst into tears, happy tears that somehow didn't smudge her makeup, and threw her arms around Marcus's neck. "I love you so much," she whispered against his shoulder. "I can't believe this day is finally here." "Neither can I," he murmured back, and for a moment, his voice carried what sounded like genuine emotion. But then, as he held Charlotte in his arms while the entire room watched this picture-perfect moment unfold, his eyes found mine over her shoulder. And he winked. It was subtle enough that no one else saw it, quick enough that it could have been explained away as a trick of the light or an involuntary muscle twitch. But I knew what I'd seen. In the middle of professing his love to my sister, in the middle of giving her a family heirloom that symbolized his commitment to their future together, Marcus Henderson had looked directly at me and winked. The message was clear. He knew exactly what he was doing. This romantic gesture wasn't about love or tradition or making Charlotte feel special on her wedding day. It was about power. He was showing me that he could perform the role of devoted fiancé so convincingly that even I, who knew the truth about him, would question my own perceptions. He was demonstrating that he was untouchable, that his reputation was so solid and his performance so flawless that no one would ever believe anything negative about him. He was the perfect groom giving his perfect bride the perfect romantic surprise, surrounded by witnesses who would all testify to his good character if anyone ever dared to suggest otherwise. After he helped Charlotte fasten the bracelet around her wrist, he kissed her hand with theatrical gallantry and prepared to leave. "I'll see you at the altar, Mrs. Henderson-to-be," he said, earning another chorus of sighs from the assembled women. But as he moved toward the door, he stopped beside my chair and leaned down as if to give me a brotherly kiss on the cheek. To anyone watching, it would have looked like an appropriate gesture from a future brother-in-law. "You look incredible," he whispered in my ear, his breath warm against my skin. "Save me that dance tonight. We have so much to talk about." Then he straightened up, flashed that charming smile at the room in general, and left to take his position for the ceremony that would begin in less than 2 hours. The room erupted in excited chatter about how romantic the surprise had been, how perfect Marcus was, how lucky Charlotte was to be marrying such a thoughtful man. Charlotte herself was glowing even brighter than before, if that was possible, holding her wrist up to admire the bracelet and declaring that this was already the most perfect day of her life. But I sat frozen in my chair, my phone heavy in my purse with its cargo of inappropriate text messages, my mind reeling from the audacity of what Marcus had just done. He'd used Charlotte's own wedding day as an opportunity to intimidate me, to show me how completely he controlled the narrative and how helpless I was to change it. He'd looked my sister in the eyes and told her he loved her while simultaneously making it clear to me that his interest lay elsewhere. He'd given her a family heirloom while whispering inappropriate comments to her sister. He'd created a moment so romantic and perfect that it would be talked about for years, all while using it as cover for continued harassment. The worst part was understanding that this was exactly what he'd wanted. He'd wanted me to see how easily he could switch between roles, how seamlessly he could move from predator to perfect fiancé and back again. He'd wanted me to understand that no matter what I knew about him, no matter what evidence I had, he would always be able to charm his way out of any accusation. Charlotte was adjusting her veil in the mirror, her face radiant with happiness, completely unaware that the man she was about to marry had just used her own wedding preparations as an opportunity to pursue her sister. She trusted him completely, loved him unconditionally, and was about to promise to spend the rest of her life with someone she didn't really know at all. I excused myself to the bathroom again, this time to be sick. The weight of what I knew, combined with the realization of how trapped I was by social expectations and family loyalty, was overwhelming. In less than 2 hours, I would have to walk down that aisle and smile while Charlotte married a predator, knowing that anything I said would be dismissed as jealousy or attention-seeking. But as I splashed cold water on my face and tried to regain my composure, I realized that Marcus had made a crucial mistake. He'd assumed that his intimidation tactics would silence me, that his show of power would convince me to stay quiet. Instead, he'd just given me all the motivation I needed to use that recording. When I returned to the bridal suite, Charlotte was posing for final photos with her bridesmaids, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that comes from believing your life is unfolding exactly as it should. The photographer captured shot after shot of the bride surrounded by her closest friends, everyone laughing and embracing as if they were starring in their own romantic movie. "Maya, there you are," Charlotte called out. "Come get in these photos. I want pictures with my sister before we head downstairs." I forced myself to smile and join the group, letting the photographer position me next to Charlotte while trying to ignore the way my hands were still trembling. The camera clicked dozens of times, capturing what would later be framed as perfect memories of the bride's final moments before walking down the aisle. "You look a little pale, honey," my mother observed, studying my face with the practiced eye of someone who'd been worrying about her daughters for 30 years. "Are you feeling all right?" The concern in her voice was genuine, but I could see the underlying tension there too. This was Charlotte's day, and any disruption to the carefully planned schedule would be seen as a crisis. My mother had spent months coordinating with vendors, managing family dynamics, and ensuring that every detail of this wedding met Charlotte's exacting standards. "Just wedding nerves," I replied, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "You know how I get at big events." It wasn't entirely a lie. I'd always been more comfortable behind the scenes than in the spotlight, more suited to handling logistics, than being the center of attention. But this was different from my usual social anxiety. This was the sick feeling that comes from carrying a secret that could destroy everything around you. "Well, take some deep breaths," my mother said, already, turning her attention back to Charlotte's veil, which needed one final adjustment. "We can't have the maid of honor looking green in all the ceremony photos." The dismissal stung more than it should have. My mother wasn't being intentionally cruel, but her priorities were clear. Charlotte's happiness came first, and anything that might threaten that happiness was to be managed, minimized, or ignored entirely. 20 minutes later, as we prepared to make our way downstairs for the ceremony, I made a decision that I immediately regretted. I pulled my phone out of my purse and scrolled to the text conversation with Marcus, screenshotting the most recent messages before walking over to Charlotte. "Charlotte," I said quietly, trying to catch her between photographer poses, "I need to show you something." She turned toward me with that radiant bride smile, but something in my expression must have warned her that this wasn't about wedding details or last-minute logistics. "What is it?" I held out my phone, showing her the screenshots of Marcus's texts. "He's been sending me these messages all morning." Charlotte's smile faltered as she read the messages, her brow furrowing in confusion rather than anger. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "What are these supposed to mean?" "He's been inappropriate with me," I said, keeping my voice low so the other bridesmaids wouldn't overhear. "Last night at the rehearsal dinner, and now these texts. Charlotte, I think you need to know who you're really marrying. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Charlotte stared at the phone screen, then at my face, then back at the screen. I watched her process the information, saw the exact moment when her brain rejected what she was seeing in favor of a more comfortable explanation. "Maya," she said finally, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before. Cold and distant. These messages are perfectly innocent. He's being nice to his future sister-in-law. Charlotte, look at them again. You're going to outshine everyone else? I've been thinking about our conversation. That's not brotherly. Stop. Charlotte held up her hand, and several of the bridesmaids turned to look at us with curiosity. Just stop. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this is not happening today. But if you would just listen. Maya. Charlotte's voice was sharp enough that our mother looked over from where she'd been coordinating with Victoria about the processional timing. I said stop. I don't want to hear another word about this. My mother approached us with the kind of determined smile that meant she was prepared to handle whatever crisis was threatening her daughter's perfect day. Is everything all right over here? Charlotte didn't hesitate. Maya's having some kind of breakdown, she said, not quite loudly. Enough for the whole room to hear, but clearly enough that several people turned to stare. She's trying to tell me that Marcus is inappropriate with her, on my wedding day. The words hung in the air like an accusation. I felt every person in the room turn to look at me, their expressions ranging from confusion to disapproval. The photographer lowered her camera, suddenly uncomfortable about documenting what was clearly becoming a family drama. Maya, my mother said, her voice carrying a warning. What's this about? I looked around the room at all these women who had spent the morning celebrating Charlotte's happiness, who had invested hours in creating the perfect wedding day experience. They were all staring at me like I'd just announced my intention to burn the building down. He sent me inappropriate text messages, I said, holding up my phone again. And last night at the rehearsal dinner, he cornered me and… Enough. My mother's voice cut through my explanation like a blade. Maya, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this stops right now. This is your sister's wedding day. Not the time for whatever attention-seeking behavior this is. The phrase attention-seeking behavior hit me like a physical blow. My own mother, who had raised me to be honest and stand up for what was right, was dismissing my attempt to protect my sister as a plea for attention. I'm not seeking attention, I said, hearing my voice start to crack. I'm trying to warn Charlotte about the man she's about to marry. No, Charlotte said firmly. You're trying to ruin my wedding because you can't stand that I'm happy. You've always been jealous of me, and now you're making up stories about my fiancé because you can't bear to see me have something beautiful. The accusation was so far from the truth that I actually laughed, a bitter sound that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. Jealous? Charlotte, I would never. You would and you are, she interrupted. You've always resented that things come easier for me, that I found someone who loves me, that I'm getting married while you're still alone. And now you're trying to destroy the best thing that's ever happened to me with lies. I felt something break inside my chest. This was my sister, the person I'd protected and supported my entire life, accusing me of jealousy and deception. The woman I'd spent the morning helping prepare for her wedding was looking at me like I was a stranger, like I was an enemy. They're not lies, I whispered, but even I could hear how weak my voice sounded. Yes, they are, my mother said firmly, and we're not going to discuss this any further. Maya, you need to decide right now whether you're going to be part of your sister's wedding or whether you're going to continue this, whatever this is. The ultimatum was clear. Support Charlotte unconditionally or be excluded from the family. Celebration. Choose the lie that preserved harmony or face the consequences of insisting on an inconvenient truth. I looked around the room one more time, hoping to see even one face that showed doubt or concern about my allegations. Instead, I saw disapproval, embarrassment, and pity. They all thought I was the problem. I spent the next hour in a fog of disbelief, mechanically going through the motions of being a bridesmaid while my mind reeled from Charlotte's reaction. The processional lined up exactly as rehearsed, with me taking my designated position as the maid of honor, despite feeling like I was sleepwalking through someone else's nightmare. The other bridesmaids whispered among themselves, casting occasional glances in my direction that ranged from curious to sympathetic to openly judgmental. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of traditional vows and carefully orchestrated romance. Charlotte looked radiant as she walked down the aisle on our father's arm, her train flowing behind her like something from a fairy tale. Marcus stood at the altar looking every inch the devoted groom, his eyes filled with what appeared to be genuine emotion as he watched his bride approach. I stood at Charlotte's side during the exchange of vows, holding her bouquet and trying to smile at the appropriate moments while fighting waves of nausea. When Marcus promised to love, honor, and cherish Charlotte for the rest of their lives, his voice was steady and sincere. When Charlotte pledged her devotion to the man she believed him to be, tears of joy streamed down her face. The kiss that sealed their marriage was met with thunderous applause from the 300 guests who had gathered to witness their union. Rice and flower petals filled the air as the newly married couple made their way back down the aisle, beaming with happiness and completely unaware that the maid of honor trailing behind them was carrying evidence that could destroy their perfect beginning. During the cocktail hour that followed, I found myself increasingly isolated from the celebration. Other family members who had heard whispered accounts of my outburst in the bridal suite kept their distance, treating me with the kind of careful politeness usually reserved for unstable relatives at family gatherings. My attempts to engage in normal conversation were met with awkward responses and quick subject changes. It was during this social exile that I began to notice things I'd previously dismissed or overlooked. Watching Marcus work the crowd during the reception, I started to see patterns in his behavior that painted a disturbing picture of calculated manipulation extending far beyond what I'd experienced personally. At the gift table, I overheard Marcus talking to Charlotte's college friend Jessica, a recently divorced marketing executive who'd driven 6 hours to attend the wedding. His hand rested on her lower back as he leaned in to speak to her, staying there just a fraction too long for casual conversation. When she stepped away to refresh her drink, his eyes followed her movement in a way that had nothing to do with polite interest. "She's having a hard time since her divorce," I heard him tell Charlotte when she joined them a few minutes later. "I was just offering to put her in touch with some contacts in her field. You know how I like to help people." Charlotte's face glowed with pride at her husband's generosity, completely missing the way Marcus's gaze lingered on Jessica's figure as she moved through the crowd. But I saw it, and I remembered similar moments from family gatherings over the past 18 months that I'd rationalized away at the time. During the dinner service, I watched Marcus's interactions with the female serving staff. He was charming and appreciative, the kind of guest who made their jobs easier with his friendly demeanor and generous tips. But there was something else there too, a way of making eye contact that lasted just a beat too long, compliments that were just slightly more personal than necessary. "You have beautiful eyes," I heard him tell one of the servers as she refilled his wine glass. "Has anyone ever told you that you could be a model?" The young woman, probably no more than 22, blushed and stammered a thank you before hurrying away. Charlotte, deep in conversation with relatives at the head table, missed the entire exchange. But I noticed how Marcus's attention followed the server as she moved to other tables, and I wondered how many other women had received similar compliments from the charming groom. The most disturbing realization came during the dancing portion of the reception. As I watched Marcus move through the crowd, dancing with Charlotte's female relatives and family friends, I began to catalog behaviors I'd witnessed but never connected before. His hands had a tendency to wander during slow dances, resting just slightly lower than was appropriate on partners' backs. His conversation during these dances was punctuated with compliments that seemed designed to make women feel special and slightly uncomfortable at the same time. With Charlotte's 19-year-old cousin Emma, he commented on how she'd grown into such a beautiful young woman since he'd last seen her at Christmas. With our 60-year-old Aunt Carol, he mentioned how ageless she was and how lucky her husband was to have such an attractive wife. Each compliment was delivered with that same charming smile and sincere tone that made it difficult to object. to without seeming oversensitive. But the pattern was unmistakable once I started looking for it. Marcus Henderson was a man who couldn't resist testing boundaries with any woman who crossed his path. He was subtle about it, careful to maintain plausible deniability, but consistent in his need to make every female interaction about his ability to charm and manipulate. I thought back to family gatherings where I'd noticed other women seeming slightly uncomfortable around Marcus, but dismissed it as shyness or social awkwardness. Now I wondered how many of them had received inappropriate comments or unwanted attention that they'd chosen not to report, rather than risk being labeled as troublemakers or attention seekers. The most chilling moment came when I watched him dance with our 16-year-old cousin Sarah, Charlotte's youngest bridesmaid. His behavior was outwardly appropriate. He kept proper distance, his hands stayed where they should, and his conversation appeared innocent. But there was something predatory in the way he looked at her, an assessment that made my skin crawl. When the dance ended, he made a point of telling Sarah how mature she seemed for her age, how she was going to be quite the heartbreaker in college. Sarah giggled and blushed, clearly flattered by the attention from her sophisticated new cousin-in-law, but I saw the way Marcus filed away her reaction, cataloging her response for future reference. That's when I understood that what had happened to me wasn't an isolated incident or a moment of poor judgment brought on by wedding stress. It was part of a systematic pattern of behavior that Marcus had been refining for years. He was a predator who had learned to hide in plain sight, using his charm and social status as camouflage, while he identified and groomed potential victims. Charlotte hadn't married a man who had made one inappropriate pass at her sister. She'd married a man who made it his business to test the boundaries of every woman he encountered, who used his position of trust and respectability to gain access to potential victims, who had spent 18 months not just courting her, but studying her family to identify the most vulnerable targets. And now he had legal and social ties to our family that would make it even easier for him to continue his pattern of manipulation and abuse. The revelation that Marcus's behavior was a pattern rather than an isolated incident changed everything for me. As the reception continued around me, I found myself shifting from victim to investigator, methodically documenting evidence that I had been too naive or trusting to recognize before. I started with my phone, carefully reviewing every text message Marcus had ever sent me over the past 18 months. What I'd previously dismissed as friendly overtures now took on a sinister undertone when viewed through the lens of intentional grooming. The birthday message where he'd called me special and said Charlotte was lucky to have such an amazing sister. The Christmas text where he'd mentioned how stunning I looked in the family photos. The random check-ins asking about my dating life and whether I was taking care of myself. Each message had seemed innocent at the time, the kind of thing a caring future brother-in-law might send. But now I could see the calculated progression, the way he'd been testing my boundaries and gauging my responses for months before making his move at the rehearsal dinner. During a quiet moment when most guests were focused on the cake-cutting ceremony, I retreated to a corner table and opened the note-taking app on my phone. I began creating a timeline of every uncomfortable interaction I could remember, dating back to the first time Charlotte had brought Marcus to a family gathering. The 4th of July barbecue last year. Marcus had offered to help me carry dishes from the kitchen, using the opportunity to comment on how I was wasted on the guys I'd been dating. At the time, I'd thought he was being protective in a brotherly way. Charlotte's birthday party in September. He'd cornered me in the hallway while I was looking for the bathroom, standing close enough that I'd had to press myself against the wall to maintain personal space. He'd asked detailed questions about my living situation, specifically whether I felt safe living alone. Thanksgiving dinner. Marcus had volunteered to drive me home when my car wouldn't start, spending the entire 20-minute ride asking personal questions about my romantic history and making comments about how I deserved someone who would appreciate my intelligence and beauty. The pattern was undeniable once I laid it out chronologically. Marcus Henderson had been systematically grooming me for over a year, using family gatherings and his relationship with Charlotte as cover for increasingly inappropriate behavior. But I needed more than just my own memories and text messages. I needed corroborating evidence that would be impossible to dismiss as jealousy or misinterpretation. So I began what felt like the most surreal investigation of my life, gathering proof of my new brother-in-law's predatory behavior at his own wedding reception. I started with the catering staff. During a brief lull in the dinner service, I approached the young server Marcus had complimented earlier, a college student named Brittany who was working the event to earn extra money for textbooks. "Excuse me," I said quietly, showing her my phone with the voice recording app ready. "I'm the bride's sister, and I'm conducting some follow-up interviews about tonight's service. Would you mind if I recorded a quick comment about your interactions with the wedding party?" Brittany agreed readily, probably thinking this was standard procedure for high-end events. When I asked about any memorable interactions with guests, she immediately mentioned Marcus. "Oh, the groom was super nice," she said, her voice clear on the recording. "He kept complimenting my eyes and asking personal questions about school and whether I had a boyfriend. He said I was too pretty to be working and should consider modeling instead. It was kind of weird because usually wedding guests don't really notice the serving staff, you know?" When I asked if his behavior had made her uncomfortable, Brittany hesitated before admitting that it had. "I mean, he seemed like a nice guy, but it felt a little, I don't know, inappropriate. Like, he's getting married today and he's hitting on the help? I just tried to stay professional and avoid being alone with him." The recording captured not just her words, but the genuine discomfort in her voice as she described Marcus's behavior. This wasn't someone with an agenda against him. This was an objective witness describing inappropriate conduct from the groom at his own wedding. Next, I sought out Jessica, Charlotte's college friend who had been on the receiving end of Marcus's attention during cocktail hour. I found her, in the ladies' room, touching up her lipstick and looking slightly frazzled. "Jessica." "Hi," I said, trying to sound casual despite my racing heart. "I hope you're having a good time tonight." "Oh, absolutely," she replied, but something in her expression suggested otherwise. "Charlotte looks incredible and Marcus seems like a great guy." I took a calculated risk. "Has Marcus been helpful tonight? I noticed him talking to you earlier about work contacts." Jessica's face changed subtly, a flicker of discomfort crossing her features. "Yeah, he offered to introduce me to some people in his network. Very generous of him." "Did he mention anything else?" I pressed gently. There was a long pause before Jessica spoke again, her voice quieter now. "He asked me a lot of personal questions about my divorce, about whether I was dating anyone, how I was handling being single again. It felt a little intense for someone I just met, but I figured he was just trying to be supportive." I managed to steer the conversation toward getting her to repeat some of Marcus's more inappropriate comments on my phone's recording app, framing it as gathering stories for a surprise video tribute to the bride and groom. Jessica unknowingly provided a detailed account of Marcus's overly personal questions and inappropriate compliments, her discomfort evident even as she tried to rationalize his behavior. The most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the photos and videos that guests had been sharing on social media throughout the evening, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Charlotte's teenage cousin Sarah had posted several videos to her Instagram story, including one from the dance floor where Marcus was spinning her around during their dance. The audio quality was poor due to the background music, but when I put in earbuds and listened carefully, I could hear Marcus's voice clearly. "You're going to be such a knockout in college," he was saying, his tone warm and avuncular to anyone who might overhear. "I bet the boys can't keep their hands off you already." Sarah giggled in response, clearly flattered. But Marcus continued. "You know, if you ever need advice about anything, dating, boys, college life, you can always come to me. Your cousin Charlotte doesn't need to know about our conversations." Sometimes it's easier to talk to someone who's not immediate family. The implication was crystal clear. Marcus was positioning himself as a confidential advisor to a 16-year-old girl, someone she could turn to for private conversations about intimate topics. He was creating a pathway for inappropriate contact with a minor, using his new status as family to gain access and trust. I saved the video immediately, before Sarah might think to delete it, and took screenshots of the timestamp and her Instagram handle as proof of when and where it was recorded. By the time the reception moved into its final hour, I had accumulated a digital archive of evidence that painted an undeniable picture of Marcus Henderson as a systematic predator. Voice recordings of his inappropriate behavior with staff, witness accounts of his boundary crossing with female guests, photographic evidence of his grooming behavior with a minor, and a comprehensive timeline of his escalating inappropriate conduct with me over the past 18 months. But the most crucial piece of evidence remained the original recording from the rehearsal dinner, where Marcus's own voice clearly demonstrated his intentions and his belief that he could manipulate women with impunity. As I sat in the empty bridal suite at the end of the evening, uploading all of my files to a secure cloud storage account, I realized that I now possessed something Marcus Henderson had never expected anyone to have: proof. The reception was winding down when I received a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Meet me in the gardens behind the manor." Someone who saw everything. My heart hammered as I stared at the message. After hours of feeling completely isolated, someone was reaching out to me. But the anonymous nature of the text made me cautious. It could be Marcus himself, trying to lure me into a private confrontation where he could intimidate me further without witnesses. I waited 15 minutes before making my decision. The alternative was going home with all my evidence, but no one. To corroborate my story, no one who would believe that the charming groom was actually a predator. I needed allies, and if someone was willing to step forward, I had to take the risk. The gardens behind Riverside Manor were dimly lit by strategically placed lanterns that created romantic ambiance for wedding photos. Most of the guests were either heading home or gathered in the main hall for last dances, so the area was largely deserted. I followed the stone pathway deeper into the garden, my heels clicking against the pavement in the quiet night air. I found her sitting on a wrought iron bench beneath an arbor heavy with late-blooming roses. At first, I didn't recognize her. A woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and elegant posture, wearing a navy dress that suggested she was one of the wedding guests. Then she turned toward me, and I realized it was Patricia Henderson, Marcus's mother. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, my voice catching with surprise. "You're the one who texted me?" She gestured for me to sit beside her on the bench, her expression grave in the soft lantern light. "Please, call me Patricia. And yes, I sent that message because I've been watching you all evening. You've been documenting my son's behavior, haven't you?" The directness of her question caught me off guard. I'd expected to have to convince whoever had contacted me that Marcus was a problem. I hadn't anticipated that his own mother would be the one reaching out. Yes, I admitted, carefully. "I've been collecting evidence of inappropriate behavior." Patricia nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "How long has he been pursuing you?" "About 18 months, I said, still reeling from the surreal nature of this conversation. "It started with comments and text messages, then escalated last night at the rehearsal dinner. And tonight, during his own wedding reception, he continued the harassment?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshots of Marcus's text messages from that morning. Patricia read them without expression, but I saw her jaw tighten as she scrolled through the increasingly inappropriate content. "Mrs. Henderson, Patricia, I need you to know that I never encouraged this behavior. I love my sister, and I would never—" "I know," she interrupted quietly. "You're not the first." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out her own phone, opening a folder labeled Documentation that contained dozens of files. Marcus is my son, and I love him, she said, her voice steady but pained. But I stopped making excuses for his behavior years ago. You're not the first woman to experience his attention. And unless something changes drastically, you won't be the last. She showed me her phone screen, which contained a comprehensive record of complaints, incidents, and concerning behaviors dating back to Marcus's college years. Photos of text message conversations with other women. Screenshots of social media interactions that crossed professional boundaries. Even recorded phone calls where Marcus could be heard making inappropriate propositions to women who had trusted him. His father and I have been trying to get him into therapy for years, Patricia continued. We've paid for treatment. We've set boundaries. We've even cut off financial support when his behavior became particularly egregious. Nothing works. He's become increasingly sophisticated at hiding his predatory behavior behind charm and social respectability. I stared at the evidence on her phone, trying to process the implications. You've known about this for years, and you let him marry my sister? Patricia's composure cracked slightly, and I saw genuine anguish cross her features. We hoped that marriage might change him, that having something stable and meaningful in his life might cure whatever drives this compulsive behavior. We were wrong. She scrolled to a recent entry in her documentation, a complaint from a woman named Jennifer, who had worked at Marcus's consulting firm until 3 months ago. The woman had filed a formal HR complaint about Marcus's inappropriate behavior, including unwanted touching, sexually explicit comments, and threats to damage her career if she reported him. Jennifer was paid a substantial settlement and signed a non-disclosure agreement, Patricia explained. Marcus's father used his connections to ensure the complaint never became public. We thought that might be a wake-up call for Marcus, but clearly it wasn't. The most disturbing revelation came when Patricia showed me a folder labeled Family Events. It contained records of Marcus's inappropriate behavior with relatives, family friends, and even service providers at previous gatherings. His pattern of targeting women in vulnerable positions, divorced friends, young cousins, employees, was meticulously documented. I started keeping these records after the third woman came to me personally, Patricia said. They all told similar stories. Marcus would identify someone he perceived as isolated or vulnerable, then systematically work to gain their trust before making his move. When they rejected his advances, he would either disappear from their lives or, in some cases, retaliate through professional or social channels. She showed me photographs of legal documents, restraining orders, harassment complaints, employment disputes that had all been quietly settled out of court. Marcus Henderson wasn't just a man who made inappropriate comments. He was a serial predator with a documented history of escalating behavior. There was a long pause before Jessica spoke again, her voice quieter now. He asked me a lot of personal questions about my divorce, about whether I was dating anyone, how I was handling being single again. It felt a little intense for someone I just met, but I figured he was just trying to be supportive. I managed to steer the conversation toward getting her to repeat some of Marcus's more inappropriate comments on my phone's recording app, framing it as gathering stories for a surprise video tribute to the bride and groom. Jessica, unknowingly, provided a detailed account of Marcus's overly personal questions and inappropriate compliments, her discomfort evident even as she tried to rationalize his behavior. The most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the photos and videos that guests had been sharing on social media throughout the evening, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Charlotte's teenage cousin Sarah had posted several videos to her Instagram story, including one from the dance floor where Marcus was spinning her around during their dance. The audio quality was poor due to the background music, but when I put in earbuds and listened carefully, I could hear Marcus's voice clearly. "You're going to be such a knockout in college," he was saying, his tone warm and avuncular to anyone who might overhear. "I bet the boys can't keep their hands off you already." Sarah giggled in response, clearly flattered, but Marcus continued, "You know, If you ever need advice about anything, dating, boys, college life, you can always come to me. Your cousin Charlotte doesn't need to know about our conversations. Sometimes it's easier to talk to someone who's not immediate family. The implication was crystal clear. Marcus was positioning himself as a confidential advisor to a 16-year-old girl, someone she could turn to for private conversations about intimate topics. He was creating a pathway for inappropriate contact with a minor, using his new status as family to gain access and trust. I saved the video immediately, before Sarah might think to delete it, and took screenshots of the timestamp and her Instagram handle as proof of when and where it was recorded. By the time the reception moved into its final hour, I had accumulated a digital archive of evidence that painted an undeniable picture of Marcus Henderson as a systematic predator. Voice recordings of his inappropriate behavior with staff, witness accounts of his boundary crossing with female guests, photographic evidence of his grooming behavior with a minor, and a comprehensive timeline of his escalating inappropriate conduct with me over the past 18 months. But the most crucial piece of evidence remained the original recording from the rehearsal dinner, where Marcus's own voice clearly demonstrated his intentions and his belief that he could manipulate women with impunity. As I sat in the empty bridal suite at the end of the evening, uploading all of my files to a secure cloud storage account, I realized that I now possessed something Marcus Henderson had never expected anyone to have: proof. The reception was winding down when I received a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Meet me in the gardens behind the manor. Someone who saw everything." My heart hammered as I stared at the message. After hours of feeling completely isolated, someone was reaching out to me. But the anonymous nature of the text made me cautious. It could be Marcus himself, trying to lure me into a private confrontation where he could intimidate me further without witnesses. I waited 15 minutes before making my decision. The alternative was going home with all my evidence, but no one to corroborate my story, no one who would believe that the charming groom was actually a predator. I needed allies, and if someone was willing to step forward, I had to take the risk. The gardens behind Riverside Manor were dimly lit by strategically placed lanterns that created romantic ambiance for wedding photos. Most of the guests were either heading home or gathered in the main hall for last dances, so the area was largely deserted. I followed the stone pathway deeper into the garden, my heels clicking against the pavement in the quiet night air. I found her sitting on a wrought iron bench beneath an arbor heavy with late-blooming roses. At first, I didn't recognize her, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and elegant posture, wearing a navy dress that suggested she was one of the wedding guests. Then she turned toward me, and I realized it was Patricia Henderson, Marcus's mother. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, my voice catching with surprise. "You're the one who texted me?" She gestured for me to sit beside her on the bench, her expression grave in the soft lantern light. "Please, call me Patricia. And yes, I sent that message because I've been watching you all evening. You've been documenting my son's behavior, haven't you?" The directness of her question caught me off guard. I'd expected to have to convince whoever had contacted me that Marcus was a problem. I hadn't anticipated that his own mother would be the one reaching out. Yes, I admitted, carefully. "I've been collecting evidence of inappropriate behavior." Patricia nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "How long has he been pursuing you?" "About 18 months, I said, still reeling from the surreal nature of this conversation. "It started with comments and text messages, then escalated last night at the rehearsal dinner. And tonight, during his own wedding reception, he continued the harassment?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshots of Marcus's text messages from that morning. Patricia read them without expression, but I saw her jaw tighten as she scrolled through the increasingly inappropriate content. "Mrs. Henderson." "Patricia, I need you to know that I never encouraged this behavior. I love my sister, and I would never—" "I know," she interrupted quietly. You're not the first. The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out her own phone, opening a folder labeled Documentation that contained dozens of files. Marcus is my son, and I love him, she said, her voice steady but pained. But I stopped making excuses for his behavior years ago. You're not the first woman to experience his attention, and unless something changes drastically, you won't be the last. She showed me her phone screen, which contained a comprehensive record of complaints, incidents, and concerning behaviors dating back to Marcus's college years. Photos of text message conversations with other women, screenshots of social media interactions that crossed professional boundaries, even recorded phone calls where Marcus could be heard making inappropriate propositions to women who had trusted him. His father and I have been trying to get him into therapy for years, Patricia continued. We've paid for treatment. We've set boundaries. We've even cut off financial support when his behavior became particularly egregious. Nothing works. He's become increasingly sophisticated at hiding his predatory behavior behind charm and social respectability. I stared at the evidence on her phone, trying to process the implications. You've known about this for years, and you let him marry my sister? Patricia's composure cracked slightly, and I saw genuine anguish cross her features. We hoped that marriage might change him, that having something stable and meaningful in his life might cure whatever drives this compulsive behavior. We were wrong. She scrolled to a recent entry in her documentation, a complaint from a woman named Jennifer who had worked at Marcus's consulting firm until 3 months ago. The woman had filed a formal HR complaint about Marcus's inappropriate behavior, including unwanted touching, sexually explicit comments, and threats to damage her career if she reported him. Jennifer was paid a substantial settlement and signed a non-disclosure agreement, Patricia explained. Marcus's father used his connections to ensure the complaint never became public. We thought that might be a wake-up call for Marcus, but clearly it wasn't. The most disturbing revelation came when Patricia showed me a folder labeled Family Events. It contained records of Marcus's inappropriate behavior with relatives, family friends, and even service providers at previous gatherings. His pattern of targeting women in vulnerable positions, divorced friends, young cousins, employees, was meticulously documented. I started keeping these records after the third woman came to me personally, Patricia said. They all told similar stories. Marcus would identify someone he perceived as isolated or vulnerable, then systematically work to gain their trust before making his move. When they rejected his advances, he would either disappear from their lives or, in some cases, retaliate through professional or social channels. She showed me photographs of legal documents, restraining orders, harassment complaints, employment disputes that had all been quietly settled out of court. Marcus Henderson wasn't just a man who made inappropriate comments. He was a serial predator with a documented history of escalating behavior. Why are you telling me this? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Because I saw how your family reacted when you tried to warn them earlier today, Patricia replied. I saw the same dynamic play out with other families. Marcus is very good at positioning himself as the victim when women speak up about his behavior. He's learned to use social pressure and family loyalty as weapons against his accusers. She paused, looking directly at me with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. But tonight is different. Tonight he crossed a line by pursuing you at his own wedding in front of 300 witnesses while being recorded by professional photographers and videographers. For the first time, there might be enough evidence to hold him accountable. Patricia reached into her purse again and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind used for business meetings or interviews. I've been recording conversations at family events for the past 2 years, trying to document Marcus's behavior for potential legal proceedings. Tonight, I captured something that might interest you. She pressed play, and Marcus's voice filled the quiet garden air. It was a conversation between him and his father during a quiet moment in the reception when they thought they were speaking privately. Did you see Maya tonight? Marcus's voice said clearly. She tried to cause some drama with Charlotte about me, but nobody believed her. It's perfect, actually. Now, if she tries to make trouble later, everyone will remember that she already tried to sabotage the wedding out of jealousy. His father's voice responded, "Marcus, please tell me you haven't been inappropriate with Charlotte's sister." Marcus laughed, the sound chilling in its casual dismissal. "Define inappropriate, Dad." I complimented her. I was friendly. If she read more into it than that, well, that's not my fault. Besides, who's going to believe the jealous sister over the devoted husband? The recording captured not just Marcus's admission of targeting me, but his calculated manipulation of the situation to discredit any future accusations. He had deliberately provoked a confrontation knowing that my family would side with him, creating a narrative that would protect him from consequences. Patricia turned off the recorder and looked at me with grim determination. "I can't undo the damage my son has already caused, but I can help you ensure that he faces consequences this time. The question is, are you ready to take him down?" Patricia and I spent the next hour in the garden, coordinating our plan with the precision of military strategists. She had connections that I lacked, access to the manor's sound system, relationships with key family members, and most importantly, the moral authority that came from being Marcus's own mother speaking out against her son's behavior. "The timing has to be perfect," Patricia explained as we reviewed the evidence one final time. "We need maximum impact with an audience that can't simply walk away or dismiss what they're hearing." The opportunity came sooner than expected. As we made our way back toward the manor, we could hear music and laughter coming from the main hall where the last dozen couples were still dancing. Charlotte and Marcus were in the center of the dance floor, swaying to a slow song while the remaining guests watched with the kind of sentimental fondness that comes at the end of a perfect evening. Patricia squeezed my hand once, then walked, purposefully toward the DJ booth. I watched her speak quietly to the technician, her authority unmistakable even from across the room. The young man nodded and handed her the microphone, probably assuming she wanted to make a final toast or announcement about departure arrangements. The music faded gradually, and conversations around the room died down as guests turned their attention toward the sound system. Charlotte and Marcus stopped dancing, both smiling expectantly as they assumed Patricia was about to deliver a heartfelt mother-in-law speech about love and marriage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia's voice rang out clearly through the speakers, "before this beautiful evening comes to an end, I think there's something you all need to hear." She looked directly at me and nodded. I pulled out my phone, my hands surprisingly steady despite the magnitude of what we were about to do. The recording from the rehearsal dinner was queued up and ready, connected to the sound system through the DJ's equipment. "What you're about to hear," Patricia continued, "was recorded yesterday evening during the rehearsal dinner. It's a conversation between my son Marcus and his new sister-in-law Maya, recorded without his knowledge." Charlotte's face went from confused to alarmed as she began to understand that something was very wrong. Marcus stepped forward, his charming smile faltering as he realized he was losing control of the situation. "Mom, what are you doing?" he called out, but Patricia ignored him. I pressed play. Marcus's voice filled the room with crystal clarity. "You know, I've always thought you were the more interesting sister." The effect was immediate and devastating. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Several guests gasped audibly. Charlotte's hand flew to her mouth as she heard her new husband's voice saying words that couldn't be explained away or rationalized. "Charlotte's beautiful, don't get me wrong," the recording continued. "But you're different, more mysterious, more real." Maya's voice came next, clearly uncomfortable. "Marcus, I think you should go back to the party. Charlotte's probably looking for you. She doesn't have to know. This could just be between us." The silence in the room was deafening. Every person present was hearing undeniable proof that the groom had been pursuing the maid of honor at his own rehearsal dinner, propositioning her while his bride was upstairs getting ready for their wedding. But Marcus's voice on the recording wasn't finished. Maya, you're so much more beautiful than she is. Charlotte made a sound that was part sob, part scream. The betrayal in that single recording was complete. Not just that Marcus had pursued her sister, but that he had done so by denigrating Charlotte herself, by comparing the two women and finding his bride lacking. Marcus lunged toward the DJ booth, trying to stop the playback, but Patricia stepped between him and the equipment. "Let them hear it all," she said firmly. The recording played for another 30 seconds, capturing Marcus's increasingly aggressive pursuit and Maya's clear rejection of his advances. When it finally ended, the silence that followed was absolute. Charlotte stood frozen in the center of the dance floor, still wearing her wedding dress but looking like she'd aged years in the span of minutes. Her face was pale except for 2 spots of red on her cheeks, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. "Charlotte," Marcus started, moving toward her with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Baby, this isn't what it sounds like. You know, how Maya's always been jealous of us. She probably edited, 'Stop.'" Charlotte's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. "Just stop talking." She looked around the room at the faces of family and friends who had gathered to celebrate her marriage, all of them now witnesses to the most humiliating moment of her life. Then her gaze found me, standing near the sound booth with Patricia, Henderson, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw recognition rather than accusation in her eyes. "You tried to tell me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but somehow carrying in the absolute silence of the room. "This morning, you tried to warn me, and I called you jealous." Marcus made another attempt to approach her, but Charlotte held up her hand to stop him. "Don't," she said, backing away from him. "Don't you dare come near me." The room erupted into chaos as the reality of what they'd witnessed began to sink in. Some guests began gathering their belongings and heading for the exits, clearly uncomfortable with being present for such an intimate family crisis. Others moved closer, offering support to Charlotte or demanding explanations from Marcus. Through it all, Patricia Henderson stood calmly beside the sound system, watching her son's carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. She had sacrificed her relationship with Marcus to prevent him from continuing to victimize other women, and the cost of that choice was written clearly on her face. The aftermath of the revelation unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance, of family loyalty finally aligning with truth. Charlotte stood in the center of the dance floor for what felt like an eternity, her wedding dress suddenly looking more like a costume from a play she no longer wanted to perform in. The silence stretched until my mother, who had spent the morning accusing me of jealousy and attention-seeking, walked slowly across the room toward Charlotte. "Sweetheart," she said softly, reaching for Charlotte's hands. "I'm so sorry. We should have listened to Maya. We should have protected you both." The apology wasn't directed at me, but I felt something tight in my chest begin to loosen. For months, I had carried the weight of being the family member who saw uncomfortable truths, who noticed patterns others wanted to ignore. Now, finally, the cost of that willful blindness was undeniable. Charlotte looked at me across the room, her eyes filled with tears, but also with something I hadn't seen there in years: respect. "Maya," she said, her voice stronger now despite her obvious pain, "I need to know everything, all of it." Over the next hour, as the remaining guests quietly departed and the manor staff began cleaning up the remnants of what should have been a celebration, Charlotte and I sat together in the bridal suite, while I shared everything I had discovered about Marcus's behavior. Patricia joined us, adding her own documentation to create a comprehensive picture of a man who had spent years perfecting his predatory techniques. Charlotte listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly just absorbing the magnitude of how thoroughly she had been deceived. When I showed her the recording of Marcus's conversation with his father, where he admitted to manipulating the situation to discredit me, she finally broke down completely, I called. "You jealous," she sobbed. "I accused you of trying to ruin my wedding because you couldn't stand to see me happy. How could I have been so wrong about everything?" "Because he's very good at what he does," Patricia said grimly. "Marcus has had years to perfect his manipulation techniques. He specifically chose you because you're successful, beautiful, and socially connected, the perfect cover for his activities. Your happiness and trust made you the ideal victim." The conversation that followed was unlike any Charlotte and I had ever had. For the first time in our adult lives, she listened to me not as the annoying younger sister who needed to be managed, but as someone whose judgment she valued and whose protection she needed. I told her about the patterns I'd noticed, the subtle boundary violations that had escalated over time, and the way Marcus had used family gatherings to identify and target vulnerable women. "What happens now?" Charlotte asked, still wearing her wedding dress but having removed her veil and most of her jewelry. "Legally, I mean. Can we do anything to stop him from doing this to other women?" Patricia pulled out her phone and showed us a contact entry for an attorney who specialized in sexual harassment and assault cases. "I've been consulting with him for 2 years, building a case. With the evidence we gathered tonight, plus the testimony from other victims, we might finally have enough to pursue criminal charges." The legal proceedings that followed took 8 months. During that time, 6 more women came forward with stories of harassment, assault, and professional retaliation by Marcus Henderson. The evidence Patricia and I had gathered became the foundation for a case that eventually resulted in Marcus pleading guilty to multiple counts of sexual harassment and criminal threatening. Charlotte filed for annulment, a process that was complicated by the fact that Marcus initially contested it, claiming the marriage was valid and that the evidence against him had been fabricated. But as more victims spoke out and additional evidence emerged, his legal position became untenable. The annulment was granted, and Charlotte legally reclaimed her maiden name. The transformation in our family dynamics was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of that terrible night. My parents, who had spent years treating my concerns and observations as overreactions, began actively seeking my input on important decisions. They acknowledged that their desire to maintain family harmony had made them complicit in enabling dangerous behavior. Charlotte and I developed a relationship based on mutual respect rather than the hierarchy that had defined our interactions since childhood. She often said that losing her marriage had taught her the value of having a sister who would risk everything to protect her, even when that protection was unwanted and unappreciated. 6 months after the annulment was finalized, Charlotte started volunteering with a local organization that provided support services to survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. She used her experience with Marcus to help other women recognize the warning signs of manipulative relationships before they became trapped in dangerous situations. "I was so focused on having the perfect wedding that I ignored every red flag," she told a group of survivors during one of her first speaking engagements. "My sister tried to save me from making the biggest mistake of my life, and I almost destroyed our relationship because I couldn't bear to hear the truth. As for me, the experience taught me that speaking difficult truths isn't about seeking attention or causing drama. It's about loving people enough to risk their anger in order to protect them from harm. I learned that being the family member who notices uncomfortable patterns and speaks up about concerning behavior isn't a character flaw. It's a form of service that requires tremendous courage." The recording that changed everything now sits in a legal file, part of the evidence that helped convict a predator and prevent him from victimizing other women. But more importantly, it represents the moment when silence stopped serving anyone's interests, when truth became more valuable than peace, and when a family learned that love sometimes requires the courage to destroy perfect appearances in service of protecting the people who matter most. 2 years after that devastating wedding night, I found myself standing in the same bridal suite at Riverside Manor. But this time the circumstances couldn't have been more different. Charlotte was getting ready for her second wedding, a small, intimate ceremony with David Chen, a gentle pediatric nurse she'd met during her volunteer work at the crisis center. This time, there were no elaborate preparations, no 300 guests, and no doubt about the character of the man she was marrying. "Are you sure you want to get married here again?" I asked, helping her adjust the simple cream-colored dress she'd chosen for the occasion. "Doesn't this place bring back difficult memories?" Charlotte smiled, an expression of genuine peace that I'd rarely seen on her face during her first engagement. "Actually, this is exactly where I need to get married. This is where I learned the difference between a perfect wedding and a real marriage. This is where our family learned to tell the truth to each other." The guest list for Charlotte's second wedding included only 25 people, immediate family, close friends, and several women from the support group she'd been facilitating for survivors of manipulative relationships. Patricia Henderson was among the invited guests, having become an unlikely family friend after her role in exposing Marcus's true nature. Patricia had paid a heavy price for her decision to speak out against her son. Marcus had cut off all contact with his parents, and several members of their social circle had ostracized the family for airing dirty laundry and destroying a perfectly good marriage. But Patricia told me she'd never regretted her choice. "I spent too many years enabling Marcus's behavior by making excuses and covering up his mistakes," she said during the small reception following Charlotte's ceremony. "Speaking up at his wedding was the first truly motherly thing I'd done for him in years. Setting boundaries and refusing to protect him from consequences was an act of love, even if he'll never see it that way." The legal proceedings against Marcus had revealed the full extent of his predatory behavior. During the investigation, 12 women had come forward with accusations spanning nearly a decade. The pattern was always the same. Marcus would identify women in vulnerable positions, recent divorces, career transitions, family crises, and position himself as a supportive figure before gradually escalating his inappropriate behavior. His consulting firm had quietly settled several harassment claims over the years, each accompanied by non-disclosure agreements that prevented victims from warning others about his behavior. The culture of silence and professional retaliation that protected Marcus was systematic, involving not just his family but his workplace and social networks. The case had attracted media attention, particularly because of the unusual circumstances of how the evidence was revealed. The story of a mother-in-law exposing her son's predatory behavior at his own wedding reception became a talking point in discussions about family loyalty versus accountability. Patricia received both praise and criticism for her actions, but she maintained that protecting future victims was more important than preserving family relationships. For me, the experience had fundamentally changed how I understood my role within our family and my responsibility to speak difficult truths. I'd spent years believing that my job was to keep peace and avoid confrontation, but I learned that real love sometimes requires destroying false harmony in service of protecting people from harm. The crisis center where Charlotte volunteered had asked me to speak at several of their training sessions, sharing my perspective on how family members could learn to recognize warning signs of manipulative relationships. I talked about the subtle ways predators used family gatherings to identify potential victims, and how they exploited social expectations about politeness and family loyalty to silence their accusers. "The most dangerous predators aren't the obvious ones," I would tell groups of counselors and social workers. "They're the charming ones, the ones who know exactly how to present themselves as perfect partners while systematically undermining their victims' support systems. They count on families choosing comfort over truth, and they're usually right." My own dating life had been deeply affected by what I'd learned about Marcus's manipulation techniques. I found myself hyper-aware of red flags that I might have missed before. Men who pushed boundaries, who tried to isolate me from friends and family, who used excessive charm to mask controlling behavior. The experience had made me more cautious, but also more confident in trusting my instincts when something felt wrong. Charlotte's healing process had been complicated by the public nature of her humiliation. The wedding video, which was supposed to capture the happiest day of her life, instead documented the moment her marriage imploded in front of everyone she cared about. But she'd used that pain as motivation to help other women avoid similar situations. I was so invested in having the perfect relationship that I ignored every warning sign, she told the women in her support group. I thought love meant never questioning your partner's behavior, never listening to people who tried to warn you. I learned that real love requires clear vision, not blind trust. The legal victory against Marcus had been significant but incomplete. He served 18 months in prison for multiple counts of sexual harassment and criminal threatening, but many of his victims felt that the sentence was inadequate given the scope of his crimes. More importantly, the systemic issues that had enabled his behavior, the workplace cultures that protected harassers, the family dynamics that silenced victims, the social expectations that prioritized reputation over safety, remained largely unchanged. But there had been concrete improvements. Marcus's former consulting firm had implemented new policies for reporting harassment and had eliminated the use of non-disclosure agreements in settlement negotiations. Several other companies in their industry had followed suit, creating an environment where future victims would have more support and fewer barriers to speaking out. As Charlotte and David exchanged vows in that same space where her first marriage had ended so dramatically, I thought about how truth and lies could occupy the same physical space, but create completely different realities. The first wedding had been built on deception, manipulation, and willful blindness. This ceremony was grounded in honesty, mutual respect, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal and choosing to trust again. 5 years have passed since that October night, when a wedding reception became a courtroom and a family. Learn the difference between keeping peace and keeping safe. The story of Marcus Henderson's exposure has become something of a legend in our community, referenced in discussions about consent, family loyalty, and the courage required to speak uncomfortable truths. I still live in the same small apartment, downtown, though I've since been promoted to executive director of the Millbrook Community Foundation. The experience with Marcus taught me that the skills I'd developed as the family peacekeeper, reading people's emotions, noticing patterns others missed, understanding group dynamics, were actually valuable professional assets when applied correctly. Instead of using those abilities to smooth over problems, I now use them to identify and address systemic issues within the organizations we fund. Last month, I received a letter from Jennifer Morrison, the woman who had filed the harassment complaint against Marcus at his consulting firm 3 months before his wedding. She'd seen the news coverage of the case and wanted to thank me for speaking out when she couldn't. I spent 2 years believing I was the only one, she wrote. I thought I was going crazy, that maybe I had misunderstood his intentions or overreacted to normal workplace interactions. When I saw that other women had experienced the same pattern of behavior, I finally understood that the problem was never with me. Jennifer had used the settlement money from her case to start a nonprofit organization that provided legal support to workplace harassment victims. She'd partnered with employment attorneys to challenge the use of non-disclosure agreements that prevented victims from warning others about serial predators. Your recording didn't just expose one man, her letter continued. It opened the door for dozens of women to tell their stories without shame or fear. You gave us permission to trust our own experiences instead of gaslighting ourselves into silence. The ripple effects had extended far beyond our immediate situation. The video of Patricia Henderson exposing her son at his own wedding had gone viral, sparking national conversations about family accountability and the ways that unconditional loyalty could enable abuse. Patricia had written a book about her experience, titled When Love Requires Courage, which had become required reading in several university courses about family systems and domestic violence. Charlotte's work with the Crisis Center had evolved into a full-time career. She'd earned her master's degree in social work and now directed a program that specifically focused on helping survivors of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse. Her personal experience with Marcus gave her credibility with clients. who had been gaslit into doubting their own perceptions. "Maya saved my life," Charlotte said during a recent interview for a documentary about family-based intervention in abusive relationships. "Not just by protecting me from Marcus, but by showing me that love sometimes looks like destroying someone's illusions. I spent so many years thinking that being a good sister meant supporting whatever made me happy, regardless of whether it was actually good for me." The documentary, which premiered at the Regional Film Festival last spring, featured interviews with several of Marcus's victims and explored how predators used family dynamics to their advantage. It showed how Marcus had deliberately cultivated relationships with family members to gain access to potential victims and create a support system that would defend him against accusations. "My parents had struggled with their own roles in enabling Marcus's behavior. They'd entered family therapy to understand how their desire to maintain harmony had made them vulnerable to manipulation. The therapist helped them recognize that their response to my initial warnings, dismissing my concerns as jealousy and attention-seeking, was part of a pattern that privileged appearances over safety. We taught our daughters that keeping the family peaceful was more important than keeping the family honest," my father reflected during one of our monthly family dinners. "Maya learned to see problems that the rest of us wanted to ignore, and instead of valuing that gift, we punished her for it." The legal system had also evolved in response to cases like Marcus's. The state legislature had passed new laws requiring employers to report patterns of harassment claims to licensing boards for certain professions. They'd also created a registry that tracked settlements and complaints across different companies, making it harder for serial harassers to simply move to new organizations when their behavior was discovered. Marcus himself had been released from prison after serving his full sentence, but his professional life was effectively over. His consulting license had been revoked, and the criminal conviction made him unemployable in his former field. He'd moved to another state and taken a job in retail management, finally facing real consequences for behavior that had been enabled and covered up for years. The recording that started everything, that 4-minute and 17-second audio file from the rehearsal dinner, was now part of the permanent evidence collection at the state courthouse. But more importantly, it had become a symbol of how truth could triumph over manipulation when people found the courage to document and share their experiences. I still have the voice recording app on my phone, though I rarely use it anymore. Sometimes I wonder if that unconscious decision to start recording that night was intuition, luck, or simply the ingrained habit of someone who'd learned to protect herself by paying attention to details others missed. What I know for certain is that silence had served everyone's interests except the truth's. The moment I chose documentation over denial, evidence over politeness, protection over peace, everything changed. Not just for me or Charlotte or even Marcus, but for every woman who would never have to experience his manipulation, because someone finally said no to the conspiracy of silence that had protected him for so long. The most profound lesson wasn't about predators or family dynamics or the legal system. It was about the power that comes from trusting your own perceptions, even when everyone around you is invested in a different version of reality. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to pretend that everything is fine when you know that it isn't. Last week, I received an unexpected package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a small, intricately folded napkin shaped like a rose, along with a handwritten note. "Thank you for teaching me that some secrets are too dangerous to keep." A sister who finally found her voice. I don't know who sent it, but I understood the message perfectly. Somewhere out there, another woman had found the courage to speak up, to trust her instincts, to choose protection over politeness. The ripple effects continue, spreading far beyond anything I could have imagined that terrible night 5 years ago. Charlotte called me yesterday with news that still gives me chills. Marcus had been arrested again, this time in his new state, for harassing a coworker at his retail job. But here's the part that matters. The woman didn't suffer in silence. She immediately reported his behavior, documented every interaction, and refused to be intimidated into dropping the charges. She told the police she'd read about our case online, Charlotte said, her voice filled with amazement. She said our story taught her that predators count on women staying quiet, and she decided not to give him that power. That young woman will never know how her courage validated every difficult choice we made. She'll never know that her refusal to be silenced prevented Marcus from establishing a new pattern of victims in a new location. But she understood something crucial. Truth shared becomes truth multiplied. The folded napkin sits on my desk now, a reminder that the smallest acts of courage can create change in ways we'll never fully know. Every time someone chooses to document suspicious behavior, every time someone believes a victim's story, every time someone prioritizes safety over social comfort, they're contributing to a world where predators can't hide behind charm and family. Loyalty. I learned that being the person who notices uncomfortable patterns isn't a burden. It's a superpower that requires cultivation and courage to use effectively. The quiet ones really do remember best, and sometimes our memories become other people's protection. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong, please hit that subscribe button. Share these stories with people who need to hear them. Together, we can create a world where truth doesn't require an audience to be valid, where protection doesn't require permission, and where love means having the courage to see clearly, even when the truth is inconvenient. Your subscription helps us continue sharing stories that matter, stories that might just give someone else the courage to trust their instincts and speak their truth. Thank you for listening, and remember, you're stronger than you think, and your voice matters more than you know.